Hello. We have been talking about world order, and we turned our attention to Europe, some of the history that's pertinent to world order, especially the Treaty of Westphalia, and the whole system of the international liberal order that evolved out of that. We've also looked at the Middle East, not exhaustively, but I thought it's time to turn our attention a bit to Asia, especially to the two dominant powers of China and India, and to consider some of the spiritual inspirations that lie behind the great outward manifestations of the Chinese political economy and the Indian political economy, and to see what implications this might have for a global world order. We remember that in that BRICS bloc, which is the biggest trading bloc on the planet today, both China and India are included, and they are the most populous countries in the world, over 1 billion people in each nation. Now, India's got a great tradition of religion and philosophy, and the native religions of India, like Jainism and Hinduism especially, which is the largest religious grouping in India, have continued to this day. There have been other imported religions. Well, Buddhism was a native religion for India. It sort of developed as a contrast, as a bit of a progressive reaction to the Hinduism of the day. But Buddhism has been a great religion of export, because from India it went up to China, and from China to Japan, especially in its Zen influence. But India has also received the impress of Islam, because Islam has come to India, Christianity has come to India. Islam has been more prevalent, and in fact it was the ruling religion of the Mughal Empire, the Mughal Empire, which ruled India around the time when Europe was developing into the dominant power in the world. And the Hindu princedoms existed under this Muslim-led empire, and they were played off one against the other at times. But India has been through a lot of turbulence, and we know that in modern times it has had to throw off the yoke of the British Empire, and there was a big drive for India to be returned to the Indians in terms of home rule, self-government, from the early part of the 20th century. And that movement, of course, was led by Mahatma Gandhi, and his close associate, Nehru, became the first Prime Minister of modern India. Now, both Gandhi and Nehru were secular in their vision for India. The inspiration behind Gandhi's opposition to the British Empire, the British colonisation of India, and to British trade practices which were impoverishing India, was inspired by native religious ideals. Gandhi was born into a Hindu family, but he drew a lot of inspiration from Jainism. And two of the leading principles in his movement were Satyagraha and Ahimsa. The first principle, Satyagraha, was to do with the moral force, spiritual force. So where there is injustice that is backed by coercive physical military power, it needs to be challenged and stood up to non-violently, but forcefully nevertheless, but using the moral and spiritual force, which is Satyagraha, and in there is Satya, the word for truth. So it is about speaking truth to power and relying on spiritual power to do one's battles for one. And the other principle I mentioned, Ahimsa, is non-violence. And in the provenance of Jainism, it involves a respect and a reverence for life at all levels. So much so that some Jains have worn masks in the past so that they don't inhale insects and destroy them, and they're mindful of treading on insects on the ground as well. But when this became appropriated for political purposes under the Mahatma, it was an injunction not to return force for force, non-violence. So you have to combine it with the Satyagraha to get the full effect. Now, Gandhi wanted all Indians, especially the two principal groupings, Hindus and Muslims, to work together to liberate India. And he envisaged and hoped for a united India at the end of the colonial period. And so did Nehru. But the rivalry and the factionalism and the attachment to religion broke this up, as we know, and there was a partitioning that had to take place so that what was basically the extent of India under the British Raj got broken up so that the central area became majority Hindu, and in what we know as Pakistan and Bangladesh became majority Muslim. And there's been a standoff and tensions ever since, especially between Delhi and Pakistan. Both India and Pakistan are nuclear-armed powers. So religious sectarianism was not laid to rest, even by a campaign like Gandhi's, and being headed up by such a charismatic and wise leader as Gandhi, it still broke up. In a way, this was a foreshadowing that India's subscription to a Western-style international liberal order was not going to be uncomplicated. Colonial states typically invoke the system of sovereign national states after the Westphalian pattern in the wake of decolonisation. But Here we have religious sectarianism breaking up the nation, and today we have the BJP party of Narendra Modi on the ascendant, and it could be described as a Hindu nationalist party, which is sort of self-consciously Hindu. It identifies India, I think, with old Hindustan, and it proudly proclaims that quality of the Indian makeup, the Indian nation, the Indian people. And a lot of people are concerned about the Muslim minority in the country and how they may be discriminated against and so on, which is bound to happen in any country with minorities. It's meant to be run for all Indians, but I think it's a state with essentially a Hindu orientation, and that will influence its foreign policy and the way that it views the world. And of course, Narendra Modi has been big on promoting the culture of India, including the culture of its spirituality, and especially the emphasis that is placed on International Yoga Day, which I think happens around the solstice. Now, other countries, of course, court India. It's been courted in that Quad dialogue between America and Australia and Japan and India because of its strategic position. It is regarded as possibly a bulwark against Chinese power. It's a big state. It'll probably overtake China in population. It may take longer for it to be able to match the economic capacity of China, which rivals that of the United States. Because India is just there dominates the Indian Ocean between Africa and Straits of Malacca, and then you've got the Pacific, and you often hear these terms Indo-Pacific because there's a lot of interest and focus on this area. And the United States, since the Second World War, has been the primary power in this area until recently. It's had close relations with Japan and the Philippines and South Korea, and now Taiwan, of course, is a point of contestation, as well as the waterways, the South China Sea in particular, as well as the East China Sea between China and Japan. But in the South China Sea, I think you have like 6 different countries with claims over the waterways, and through that waterway goes several $1 trillion of world trade each year. So it is an incredibly important waterway, and the United States, we can see from history, doesn't want to abandon that area, and it's very nervous about the rise of China, a great power which looks out onto that waterway. Now, we will talk a bit more about China in the next clip. But I think just getting back to India, such a big country, and it's hard to imagine it without its interaction with the Western world. which began with Europeans, Dutch and French and so on, and then significantly the English, whose presence developed into an imperial occupation. India became the jewel in the crown, and it was through the East India Trading Company principally. So we had the force of British arms and the power of its government and bureaucracy serving as backing and infrastructure for the trade that was happening between Britain and India and other parts of the world. And the trading principles and philosophy that were behind this, we may have mentioned already. Free trade, opening up of other countries. Now, from the British point of view, it seemed free-ish, but from the other country's standpoint, it could often not be experienced as free, but as exploitative. If, the cotton grown by Indian farmers is taken off to textile mills in Lancashire and so on, and then that bit of British cloth is imported back into India and sold at prices that the Indians can't buy, the Indians tend to be worse off than if they could just make their own clothes. And that was the whole point of Gandhi's spinning wheel campaign. That each householder could learn to spin their own homespun clothing. Modest, simple, but nevertheless homegrown. And it was about taking back the assets of the land and the sea into Indian control. Like with the big salt march to the sea and the making of salt in defiance of a British writ. So India should be for the Indians. There's a strong feeling of that, but there was not that national consciousness as yet. But their interaction with the British helped them develop a consciousness of Indian nationhood, because before that it was a kind of tapestry of different kingdoms and princedoms and states. Now, imperialism and colonialism do leave a bit of a legacy of resentment which has to be forgiven. Now, there are always pros and cons. The cons are often quite clear when you think about how the British forced their trade onto the Chinese with the Opium Wars in the middle of the 19th century. How did Hong Kong come under British rule? Well, because of the damages for losses that the British claimed during the Opium Wars when the Chinese wanted to resist the British importation of opium from India into China. There was a huge opium problem, I don't know, maybe 1 in 4 people were affected by it. It's such a strong drug. And you forget how things come about in history. We remember recently about the handing back of Hong Kong to China, but how did it end up in British hands in the first place? One of the less noble results of colonialism. But colonialism there, I suppose, as with India, brought with it an understanding of principles of law and administration and technology, building, road building, governance, and education as well. And so in India there would be an elite that were the governing class of India, like the Gandhi family, the Nehrus. These, and today, I mean, I think Narendra Modi is maybe the first Indian Prime Minister that would not be considered an elite in background. And by that I mean they're either elite by birth through membership of a particular dynasty, or they're elite by education because they'll go off to Oxford or Cambridge or one of those universities and get a Western education. This is how profound the influence of the West has been. And so one has to take the good with the bad. And certainly the Western powers that had empires overseas can't complain, I suppose, when those people at some point ask for autonomy, demand self-rule, because the principles that are enshrined for them are the very ones that the colonised peoples are invoking. Every people wants that. But does India just want to be a state after the European model? Well, it seems to be behaving in that way, although we have, and certainly Pandit Nehru, the first Prime Minister, he enunciated principles which affirmed India's neutrality and its lack of desire to get involved in the Cold War and other people's business, and affirmed that India would act in its own self-interest, and that's all predicated upon the notion of the sovereign nation state. So India does belong to organisations like the UN, and it does deal with other governments on a one-to-one basis. And yet the power base of India is populist and Hindu, and there's a strong sense of Hindu identity I keep coming back to, which seems to be part of India's destiny. I mean, the irony is, and maybe it's a tragic irony, that Gandhi thought he was being a good Hindu and universalising Hinduism by embracing Muslims as brothers and Christians and Jews and everybody else and putting them all on a footing of equality. And at the end of the day, who does he get assassinated by but an extreme Hindu nationalist? And we've seen this happen in other areas. We've seen Anwar Sadat of Egypt, for example, being assassinated by people connected to the Muslim Brotherhood after he tried to make peace with Israel. We see Itzhak Rabin, signing off on the Oslo Accords, trying to make peace with the Palestinians, and he ends up being assassinated by extremist Jews. So if a leader tries to take a middle position and mainstream minorities and bring about a condition of equality in a multicultural polity, there will be reactions from elements that are often energised and made extreme by religion, feeling that they are more the core and the heart of that country than the other groups, and that they should be privileged and given a position of primacy in the government of that country. And we definitely see that in Israel, and we are starting to see that in India as well. And I think that we have to bear these things in consideration. One thing that can be said for Hinduism is that it is very tolerant of different approaches to spirituality. Not only is it a religion of many gods, but it's a religion of many paths. And in India, I mean, the people traditionally are not used to firm formulations of doctrine that they need to adhere to in the way that Europeans have been. But they're more concerned with following a path that leads to some sort of inner transformation or liberation. And they also have a view of time, cosmically, but also historically, which is more cyclical than the Western conception of linear time, which we get from the Judeo-Christian heritage. So that's a little bit on India.